I never thought coming home after losing my job would feel like walking into enemy territory. The moment I stepped through that familiar front door in Oklahoma, something felt different. My younger brother, Derek, barely looked up from his phone, muttering something about, "Great, he's back." My parents exchanged that look, the one where they're having a whole conversation with their eyes. Mom forced a smile that didn't reach her face while Dad just grunted and went back to his newspaper. The house I grew up in suddenly felt like I was intruding on someone else's life. Before we dive into this story that completely changed everything I thought I knew about family, let me ask you something. Where are you watching this from right now? Maybe you're at home, maybe you're on your lunch break, or perhaps you're lying in bed scrolling through videos. Wherever you are, if this story hits you in any way, please hit that like button and subscribe, because what happened next taught me the hardest lesson about family I never saw coming. 3 months earlier, I had been Milton Rodriguez, marketing specialist at a promising tech startup in Austin. 28 years old, steady paycheck, my own apartment, and what I thought was a bright future ahead of me. Then the company went under overnight. Just like that, I was unemployed with a lease I could not afford and a bank account that was shrinking faster than my confidence. Moving back to my childhood home in Tulsa seemed like the logical choice. I had always been the responsible son, the one who sent money home when Dad's construction business hit rough patches, the one who paid for Mom's medical bills when her insurance fell short. I figured my family would welcome me back with open arms while I got back on my feet. I had enough savings to last a few months, maybe longer if I was careful, and I fully intended to contribute to household expenses. But something had changed in the 2 years since I had moved to Austin. Derek, my younger brother, who was 25 and still lived at home, had somehow become the golden child. He worked part-time at Jimmy's auto shop, barely bringing home enough to cover his truck payment and weekend beer money. Yet he seemed to have more say in family decisions than I ever remembered him having. The first red flag came at dinner that first night back. Derek dominated the conversation, telling stories about his coworkers and weekend adventures, while Mom and Dad laughed at jokes that were not particularly funny. When I tried to join in sharing a funny story about my last day at the startup, Derek interrupted with, "Well, at least some of us still have jobs to tell stories about." The room went silent. Mom cleared her throat uncomfortably, while Dad suddenly became very interested in cutting his meatloaf. Derek just smirked and continued eating like he had not just delivered a deliberate insult. I waited for someone to call him out to defend me, to at least acknowledge that his comment was unnecessarily harsh. Nothing. The silence stretched until Mom asked Derek about his plans for the weekend. That night, I discovered Derek had moved into my old bedroom. Not just moved in, but completely taken over. My childhood posters were gone, replaced with his hunting photos and car magazines scattered everywhere. When I asked about sleeping arrangements, Derek shrugged and said, "You don't live here anymore, man. This is my room now." I ended up on the living room couch, feeling like a guest in my own childhood home. As I lay there staring at the ceiling, I could hear my family laughing and talking in the kitchen, their voices carrying down the hallway. For the first time, it occurred to me that maybe they had built a life that no longer included me, and my sudden return was not the blessing I thought it would be. The next morning, I offered to pay rent and help with utilities. It seemed like the right thing to do, a way to show I was not taking advantage of their generosity. Derek was sitting at the kitchen table when I made the offer to Mom and Dad, and his reaction was immediate and cutting. "We don't need your charity money," he said, not even looking up from his cereal. "Just because you couldn't make it on your own doesn't mean you get to buy your way back into this family." I stared at him, shocked by the venom in his voice. This was not the little brother I had grown up protecting, the kid I had helped with homework and taught to drive. This was someone who seemed to actively resent my existence. "Derek, that's not what I meant," I started, but he cut me off. "Sure it isn't. You show up here expecting everyone to drop everything and take care of you, then act like you're doing us a favor by throwing some money around. Real noble." Again, I looked to my parents for support, for someone to tell Derek he was being unfair. Dad just sipped his coffee and muttered something about working things out between yourselves. Mom busied herself at the sink, her back turned to the entire conversation. That was when I started to understand that this was not just Derek being difficult. Somehow, in my absence, the family dynamic had shifted, and I was no longer the son they were proud of. I had become the failure who came crawling back home. Over the next few weeks, the situation grew progressively worse. Derek seemed to take genuine pleasure in undermining me, at every opportunity. He had a talent for making cutting remarks that sounded almost casual to anyone not paying close attention but landed like carefully aimed daggers. When I was on the phone with potential employers, Derek would choose that moment to blast his music or start up his motorcycle in the driveway. When I tried to use the family computer to update my resume, I would find he had installed new games that slowed everything down. Small things, petty things, but they added up to a constant message that I was not welcome. The really painful part was watching my parents enable his behavior. They had grown comfortable with Derek as their primary focus, and his narrative about me being a burden seemed to have taken root. Family conversations would stop abruptly when I entered a room, and inside jokes I was not part of became more frequent. I started paying attention to the little signs I had initially missed. Mail addressed to me would disappear before I could see it, including responses from job applications I had submitted online. Derek claimed he had not seen anything, but I caught him smirking when I mentioned missing an interview callback. One afternoon, I decided to have a mature conversation with Derek, hoping to clear the air between us. I found him in the garage working on his truck and tried to approach the situation diplomatically. "Derek, I feel like there's some tension between us, and I want to work it out," I said. "I know my coming back home wasn't planned, but I'm doing everything I can to get back on my feet. I don't want this to affect our relationship." He did not even stop what he was doing. "There's no relationship to affect Milton. You left, remember? You went off to the big city to make it on your own, and now you're back because you couldn't hack it. That's not my problem." "I'm still your brother," I said, trying to keep the frustration out of my voice. "You're a 30-year-old man living in his parents' house," he replied, finally looking at me. "You want to know what I told Mom and Dad? I told them you'd probably try to guilt-trip them with the whole family thing when you realized Austin didn't work out. Looks like I was right." The coldness in his voice was something I had never heard before. This was not sibling rivalry or temporary annoyance. Derek genuinely seemed to view me as a threat to the comfortable life he had built while I was gone. That evening, I overheard him on the phone with our cousin Mark describing me as a loser who couldn't keep a job and laughing about how I was sleeping on the couch like some kind of homeless person. The worst part was hearing him tell Mark that our parents were getting tired of supporting him and that everyone was hoping I would figure out I'm not wanted and leave. When I confronted him about the conversation, Derek immediately went to our parents and claimed I had been listening in on private phone calls and making him uncomfortable in his own home. Without asking for my side of the story, Dad took Derek aside for what looked like a supportive conversation, while Mom asked me to try to give your brother some space. It became clear that Derek had spent the 2 years of my absence positioning himself as the good son, the one who stayed close to home and remained loyal to the family. My return threatened that narrative, and he was determined to protect his status at any cost. Mrs. Patterson, our next-door neighbor, seemed to be the only person who noticed what was happening. She had watched me grow up and remembered the young man who used to mow her lawn and shovel her driveway without being asked. One afternoon, she stopped me as I was checking the mailbox. "Milton, honey, I don't mean to pry, but is everything all right over there?" she asked gently. "I've noticed some tension, and I just want you to know that if you need someone to talk to, I'm here." Her kindness almost brought me to tears. It had been weeks since anyone in my family had spoken to me with genuine warmth, and Mrs. Patterson's concern reminded me that I was not imagining the hostility I was facing at home. Meanwhile, my job search was finally showing some promise. A marketing firm in Denver had called for a preliminary phone interview, and it had gone well enough that they wanted to schedule a face-to-face meeting. It felt like a light at the end of a very dark tunnel. Unfortunately, Derek overheard my excited phone call with the Denver company, and I could see the wheels turning in his mind. That evening at dinner, he casually mentioned to our parents that I had been looking at jobs in Colorado and wondered out loud if I was planning to stick around much longer. The way my parents perked up at this information was unmistakable. They began asking pointed questions about the Denver opportunity with an enthusiasm they had not shown for anything else related to my job search. It was clear they saw this potential job not as good news for me, but as a solution to what they had come to view as the problem of my presence in their home. That night, I lay on the couch listening to my family discuss my future in hushed voices behind the closed door of my parents' bedroom. I could not make out the exact words, but the tone was unmistakable. They were making plans that involved my departure, and they were not including me in the conversation. The Denver interview was rescheduled twice due to a family emergency on their end, which meant I would be staying home longer than originally planned. When I shared this news with my family, Derek's reaction was explosive. "Are you kidding me?" he snapped, slamming his coffee mug down on the kitchen table. "How long is this going to go on, Milton? You've been here for months, sleeping on our couch, eating our food, and now you're telling us you're not even close to leaving Derek. It's just a delay," I tried to explain. "The interview is next week now, and if it goes well, I could be moved out within a month." "A month," Derek laughed bitterly. "Right. And then what happens when that doesn't work out either? Are you going to come up with another excuse to stay? Another reason why we should all just put our lives on hold for you?" The unfairness of his attack was breathtaking. I had been actively job hunting, contributing to household expenses, despite their refusal to accept formal rent, and doing everything possible to minimize my impact on their daily routines. But in Derek's version of events, I was a lazy freeloader who was taking advantage of family generosity. "That's enough," Dad said, but not to Derek. He was looking at me. "We need to have a family meeting. All of us. Tonight." The way he said it made my stomach drop. This was not going to be a discussion about how to better support each other through a difficult time. This felt like a tribunal, and I was the defendant. That evening, we gathered in the living room where I had been sleeping for months. The seating arrangement said everything. Derek sat between our parents on the couch, a united front, while I sat alone in Dad's old recliner, facing them, like I was being interviewed for a job I did not want. Derek wasted no time launching into his prepared remarks. "Look, Milton, I think it's time we all got honest about this situation. You're 28 years old and you're living like a teenager. This isn't your home anymore. You moved out, you built your own life, and when that didn't work out, you just assumed you could come back and pick up where you left off." I started to respond, but he held up his hand to stop me. "I'm not finished. The truth is, we all moved on when you left. We built a routine, a family dynamic that works for us, and having you here disrupts all of that. You sleep in our common area, you tie up the phone line with your job interviews, and you act like we owe you something because we're related." Each word felt like a physical blow. This was not the brother I had protected from bullies, taught to ride a bike, or helped with algebra homework. This was someone who had turned my temporary misfortune into evidence of my fundamental unworthiness as a family member. Mom cleared her throat and joined in her voice, gentle, but her words devastating. "Honey, Derek has a point. When you moved to Austin, we were so proud of your independence. We adjusted to life with just the three of us, and it's been good, really good. Having you back has been complicated." Complicated, how I asked, though I was not sure I wanted to hear the answer. Dad took over. "You're not the same person who left here 2 years ago, Milton. You seem angry, defensive. You're constantly looking for problems that aren't there, making Derek feel unwelcome in his own home. We raised you to stand on your own 2 feet, not to come running back to us every time things get tough." The gaslighting was masterful. My legitimate hurt over being treated like an intruder had been reframed as me being unreasonable. Derek's obvious hostility had somehow become my fault. My parents had rewritten history to cast my return not as a son seeking temporary support during a difficult time, but as a grown man refusing to accept responsibility for his life. "I never expected this to be permanent," I said quietly. "I just needed some time to get back on my feet. I've been applying for jobs constantly. I've contributed financially, and I've tried to be as unobtrusive as possible." Derek scoffed. "Unobtrusive? You've been here for 3 months, Milton. 3 months of disrupting our lives, and for what? So you can maybe get a job in Colorado that might not even work out." That was when he delivered the line that would stay with me forever. "No one wants you here, Milton. Can't you see that?" The silence that followed was deafening. I looked at my parents, waiting for them to contradict him, to tell him he had gone too far, to show some sign that they disagreed with his brutal assessment. Instead, Mom nodded slowly. Dad's expression remained stone-faced, but he nodded too. In that moment, everything became crystal clear. This was not about my job situation or my temporary living arrangement. This was about a fundamental shift in family loyalty that had occurred while I was building my life in Austin. Derek had successfully positioned himself as the favored son, and my return threatened that status. Rather than make room for both of us, my parents had chosen to protect the family dynamic that existed without me. I sat there for a long moment, letting the full weight of their rejection settle in. There was no point in arguing no evidence I could present that would change their minds. They had made their decision, and I was not part of their future. "Okay," I said finally, standing up from the chair. "I understand." Derek looked surprised that I was not fighting back, but I was beyond arguing. I walked to the corner where I had been keeping my belongings and began methodically packing my clothes into the same suitcases I had arrived with months earlier. "Milton, you don't have to leave tonight," Mom said, though her tone suggested she hoped I would. "Yeah, I do," I replied without looking back at them. "Derek's right. Nobody wants me here." As I packed, Derek could not resist adding a few more cuts. "Maybe now you'll learn what the real world is actually like instead of expecting everyone to bail you out." I continued packing in silence while my family watched. There was no offer to help, no attempt to soften the blow of what had just happened, no suggestion that we might work things out differently. They sat there like spectators at a show waiting for me to finish and leave. When I carried my bags to the car, Mrs. Patterson was in her front yard, ostensibly watering her flowers, but obviously concerned about the commotion. She caught my eye and shook her head sadly, clearly disapproving of what she was witnessing. I loaded my belongings into the trunk of my Honda Civic and took one last look at the house I had grown up in. Derek stood in the doorway, arms crossed, making sure I actually left. My parents remained inside, avoiding the awkwardness of a goodbye. As I drove away, Derek called out, "Don't bother coming back when the Denver thing doesn't work out either." I did not look back. That first night in a roadside motel outside Tulsa was the loneliest I had ever felt. I sat on the edge of a bed that smelled like industrial cleaning products and tried to process what had just happened. My family, the people who were supposed to love me unconditionally, had essentially voted me out of their lives. But as the shock wore off, something unexpected happened. Instead of despair, I began to feel something that resembled relief. For months, I had been walking on eggshells, trying to prove I deserved a place in a home where I was clearly unwanted. I had been pouring energy into winning approval from people who had already decided I was not worth their time. I called my college friend Jake, who lived in Denver, and explained the situation. His response was immediate and furious. "Are you serious? They actually said no one wants you there, Milton? That's not family, that's abuse." Jake insisted I come stay with him while I got settled, whether the job worked out or not. His anger on my behalf was oddly comforting because it confirmed that what I had experienced was not normal family dynamics, despite what my parents and Derek had tried to make me believe. The Denver interview went better than I could have imagined. Not only did I get the job, but they offered me a salary that was 15% higher than what I had been making in Austin, along with a signing bonus that would cover my moving expenses and first few months of rent. Within 6 weeks of that devastating night in my parents' living room, I was living in a great apartment in the Capitol Hill neighborhood of Denver, working for a company that valued my skills and rebuilding my confidence one day at a time. The healing process was not immediate. For months, I would find myself replaying that final confrontation, wondering if there was something I could have said or done differently. But gradually, with the help of therapy and the support of genuine friends, I began to understand that my family's rejection said everything about them and nothing about my worth as a person. Jake introduced me to his circle of friends, people who welcomed me warmly and treated me with the kind of casual affection I had forgotten was possible. I started hiking, something I had never had time for in Austin, and discovered a love of Colorado's mountains. I joined a recreational softball league and found myself laughing more than I had in years. About 6 months after I left Oklahoma, I started dating Sarah, a graphic designer I met at a coffee shop near my office. She was kind, funny, and genuinely interested in my thoughts and dreams. When I eventually told her the story of my family situation, her reaction was swift and clear. "They don't deserve you," she said simply. "Anyone who would treat their own child that way during a difficult time isn't worth your emotional energy." It was around this time that Derek lost his part-time job at the auto shop. Apparently showing up late and leaving early had finally caught up with him. Without my financial contributions, which had been more substantial than I had ever let on, my parents began struggling with their mortgage payments. Mom called me on a Tuesday evening, her voice artificially bright, as she asked how I was doing in Denver and whether I was happy with my decision to move so far away. She worked up to the real reason for her call, gradually mentioning Dad's slow season in construction and Derek's employment situation as if these were just casual updates. We were wondering, she finally said, if you might be able to help us out a little bit, just temporarily until things get back to normal. The audacity was breathtaking. The same people who had made it clear I was unwelcome in their home were now asking for the financial support they had rejected when I offered it freely. "I'm sorry, Mom," I said calmly, "but I don't think that would be appropriate. You all made it very clear that we're not the kind of family who helps each other through difficult times." There was a long pause. "Milton, honey, you're taking this the wrong way. We never said we didn't want you to be part of the family. Actually, Derek said exactly that." And you and Dad nodded in agreement. Another pause, longer this time. "People say things when they're frustrated," she said finally. "You know we love you. Maybe you do in your way," I replied. "But love without respect, without basic kindness, isn't really love at all. It's just obligation dressed up in family language." I told her I hoped things worked out for them, but that I had built a new life in Denver and was not interested in resuming the kind of relationship we had before. She hung up after a few more attempts to guilt me into changing my mind. Derek reached out a few weeks later, his approach more direct but equally unsuccessful. He had heard about my promotion at work, probably from Mom, who had gotten the information from Mrs. Patterson, who still kept in touch with me. "Look, I know things got heated before you left," he said, as if our confrontation had been a minor disagreement, instead of a systematic campaign to drive me away from my family. "But we're blood, you know, family should stick together." "You're right," I agreed. Family should stick together. They should support each other during hard times instead of kicking someone when they're down. They should show love and kindness instead of resentment and hostility. "Come on, man, you're being dramatic. Am I Derek? You told me no one wanted me there. You sabotaged my job search, took over my bedroom, and convinced our parents that I was a burden. That's not drama. That's exactly what happened." The conversation did not last much longer. Derek was not interested in taking responsibility for his actions, just in accessing the financial stability my success could provide for the family. I blocked their numbers after that. It was not done in anger, but in recognition that some relationships are too toxic to maintain regardless of shared DNA. My life in Denver continued to flourish. I got another promotion, started a small investment portfolio, and began planning to buy a house. Sarah and I moved in together after a year of dating, and her family welcomed me with the warmth and acceptance I had once expected from my own relatives. The contrast was striking. Sarah's parents were genuinely interested in my work, asked thoughtful questions about my goals, and treated me like a valued addition to their family gatherings. Her brother invited me to play basketball with his friends and included me in group text conversations about everything from sports to restaurant recommendations. This was what healthy family dynamics looked like. This was how people who cared about each other actually behaved. 2 years after leaving Oklahoma, I realized I rarely thought about my biological family anymore. The pain of their rejection had faded, replaced by gratitude for the lesson they had inadvertently taught me about self-worth and the importance of choosing your relationships carefully. When Mrs. Patterson sent me a Christmas card with a note that my parents were asking about me, I felt nothing but mild curiosity. They had become characters in a story about my past, rather than active participants in my present life. The hardest part of the entire experience had been accepting that family loyalty is not automatically reciprocal. I had spent years believing that blood relations came with built-in obligations to support and care for each other. Learning that some people view family as a convenience rather than a commitment was painful but ultimately liberating. I stopped waiting for their approval and started building relationships with people who appreciated me for who I was, rather than resenting me for who I was not. I learned to recognize the difference between temporary conflict and fundamental incompatibility between people who want to work things out and people who want to win at any cost. Most importantly, I discovered that sometimes the most loving thing you can do for yourself is to walk away from people who consistently make you feel small, even when those people share your last name. The young man who had returned to Oklahoma, expecting comfort and support, would not recognize the confident, successful person I became in Denver. That transformation required losing my biological family, but it led me to build something much more valuable, a chosen family of people who actually wanted me in their lives. If someone reading this has experienced similar rejection from people they expected to support them, I want you to know that their failure to see your value does not diminish your worth. Sometimes the people who should love us most are the least capable of doing so, and recognizing that truth is not giving up on family. It is refusing to accept less than you deserve. The night Derek told me no one wanted me, there was the worst night of my life at the time, but it eventually became the catalyst for building the best life I could have imagined. Sometimes the most painful endings create space for the most beautiful beginnings. Your worth is not determined by other people's ability to recognize it, even when those people are supposed to love you unconditionally, especially then. Have you ever found yourself in a situation where you had to choose between your self-respect and maintaining a relationship with family members who didn't treat you well? I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments below. If this story resonated with you, please hit that like button and subscribe for more real-life stories about overcoming difficult family situations. And don't forget to share this with someone who might need to hear that they deserve better than settling for relationships that diminish their worth. Remember, sometimes walking away is the bravest thing you can do, and sometimes the family you choose is more important than the family you're born into. Thanks for listening, and I hope you find the courage to surround yourself with people who celebrate your presence instead of merely tolerating it.